I'm Morgan. Today we're gonna do a little bit more of a stripped down type of video. I'm not like gonna stand up and be like all over the place. We're gonna chill for a little bit, you and I. That's cool. I've got my coffee. I also have my favorite Aaron West and the Roaring 20s sweatshirt on. That's super comfy. The month of May is Mental Health Awareness Month. I decided that I wanted to do a more stripped down personal video. I wanted to talk about OCD representation in books and my personal story with having OCD. That is a subject that I feel would be very disingenuous if I was like, oh yeah, sometimes I have intrusive thoughts and that, and then I put in like a Vine reference and then funny music. Like, it just wouldn't feel right. I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder when I was 12, and to put that into perspective, I'm 22 now. That's 10 years of knowingly living with OCD. I had a lot more compulsions when I was a kid, which is to say that my OCD translated into a lot of like actions. Now I have very minimal compulsions and a lot of obsessive thoughts, as well as intrusive thoughts. I don't think I need to make this disclaimer. My experience with OCD is not going to be the exact same as anybody else's. Everyone's brains are wired differently. Everyone goes through their mental illnesses and everyone has different symptoms and different signs and different thoughts and different things that make them anxious. This is all just my personal, how I've lived with OCD. Like I said, I have a lot of the intrusive thoughts and the thought spirals where I think and I don't stop. Once I get really anxious about something, or once I have like a specific thought in my head, I obsess over it, and it's the only thing I'm able to think about all day. OCD is a very intrusive disorder. I don't have very many compulsions anymore. I have a lot of like little tics that I do. I had a lot of medical hypochondria that stemmed from my OCD. My OCD has definitely become less compulsive and more about the obsessive intrusive thoughts as I've gotten older. Intrusive thoughts are fun. Sometimes I'll be like walking around downtown or I'll be crossing the street. I think I could just walk in front of a car and get hit right now. And then I think about that all day. And that's a thing that a lot of people with OCD suffer from. I get anxious about them. I work in a coffee shop and sometimes I'll be like, this is like not funny, but I have to make it seem funny or I like can't deal with it. Like scooping beans to put into like the grinder, and just in the back of my head I'll just think I could just stick my hand in the grinder right now, and then I think about that all day, which is weird. Intrusive thoughts are not normal. OCD is very strange, and it's hard to explain when someone's not in your head, and it's very alienating. At least I find it very alienating, because most people, when you tell them that you have obsessive compulsive disorder, they just assume that you're really organized and you really like cleaning. I am not ashamed of my mental illness. I'm very open about the fact that I have OCD and that it's a part of me and that it's something that I live with. I used to be really embarrassed of it when I was a kid, and it was a thing I never talked about because, you know, it was really taboo to have mental illness, let alone talk about it when you're a kid. But as I've gotten older and as I've like studied psychology, and that's been the major that I'm pursuing and the degree that I'm pursuing, I have just like been much more open about talking about mental illness in general, but more specifically my own personal journey and living with my mental illness. Only way to defeat stigma and the only way to show people that stigma does not make a mental illness is to show them how you live with mental illness. OCD is very often stigmatized. My OCD does not make me fixate on cleaning or on organization. I like being clean and I like being organized. Those are two characteristics of my personality that are not impacted by my OCD at all. Most people with OCD are very like cluttered people. Most people with OCD are not fixated on cleaning and organization. I don't know where that came from. It's like they watched one episode of Monk and they were like, that's OCD. I hate watching any sort of movie or TV show where someone with OCD is present because it's always a detective show and the people with OCD are always just unbearable to be around. Like, it's awful. Watching a television show where it spotlights someone with OCD being a detective is, like, not fun for me. But it plays into the stigma that, like, people with OCD can hone in on their obsessions and their compulsions, and it helps them solve mysteries. And it's like, no, not really. It's a really good segue. I didn't want this to just be book related. Like, I wanted to be able to talk about books that mean a lot to me and have spoken to my OCD. I have a couple books that I'm going to talk about that are my favorite takes on OCD that I've read. So I have 3 books here that have OCD representation that I'm a really big fan of. The 3 books that I'm going to be talking about are The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness, History's All You Left Me by Adam Silvera, and Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. The first book I'm going to be talking about is The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness. A lot of, like, YA books and a lot of, like, dystopian books have that trope of there being, like, a chosen one, and this follows kind of that storyline but from the kids who aren't the chosen ones. Mikey's the main character and he has obsessive compulsive disorder. It's not a focal point of the book, which I really like. Mikey's OCD, though it is a part of him, is not the only part of him. That's what I can say for all of these books. People with mental illness are so much more than their mental illnesses, and I think that's a really important theme to have in a book where a character has mental illness. I believe Patrick Ness himself has OCD, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. I think that this is a really good book to read if you are just getting into reading about characters with OCD, because it's not a huge plot point. His OCD is definitely there and he talks about it and he talks about when he gets anxious, but it's not the biggest plot point. I will say that he does have a friend named Jared that has, like, powers and can, like, heal things, and there is a point where healing Mikey's OCD is talked about. I'm not gonna spoil anything, but I will say that, like, the topic of healing Mikey's OCD is there. I think that that's a really interesting take, and I think that the way that Mikey talks about himself and how he is because of his OCD is really interesting. It's not super in-depth with his thought process or his obsessions or his compulsions, and you're just getting into reading about books with OCD. This is a really good one to start with because it's not super heavy. The next one I'm going to talk about is History's All You Left Me by Adam Silvera. I do know that Adam Silvera has obsessive compulsive disorder because he talks about it, and a lot of Griffin's compulsions and obsessions are very much things that Adam Silvera deals with. I will say there is a love interest in this book that thinks that they can cure Griffin's OCD, and they, like, expose Griffin to things in a way that made me uncomfortable. It was like trying to be, like, cute exposure therapy, but it just, like, came off really love cure-y, but I think that was the intention. I don't think that was a fault in Adam Silvera's writing. I think that was a fault in that character's understanding of OCD. That this does talk a lot about Griffin's OCD. Griffin is going through losing the love of his life, who has just passed away, and having to deal with that grief and loss and learning to love after losing someone like that. And his OCD is definitely something that he is struggling with alongside his grief. I don't want to say more intense OCD, but his OCD is very prominent. My OCD is very different from Griffin's OCD, but that's because Adam Silvera and I don't have the same brain. Duh. I think that this is really good in explaining how the obsessions and compulsions can kind of work in tandem. The Rest of Us Just Live Here, Mikey is very compulsive. He has a lot more compulsions than Griffin in this and Asa in Turtles All the Way Down. Griffin has a mix of obsessions and compulsions. Most people do. I will say Mikey has more compulsions. Griffin has, like, a mix of both. And we'll talk about Turtles All the Way Down in a second. But this is, like, a medium range in, like, the intensity of how OCD is talked about. It's still covered pretty, like, with a light hand. It's not super overwhelming, but it is very good representation. And like I said, there is a love interest who tries to cure Griffin and does a lot of, like, things that made me personally uncomfortable, but that was, like, a character issue, and I think it was to show, like, how people just don't understand how mental illness works. So in that context, it was a good moment in the book. But if that's something that might, like, make you uncomfortable to read about, just there you go. This one, if you are very sensitive about reading about OCD in the sense of like it makes you uncomfortable, this might not be one you want to read. It's Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. This is the most raw, the most intense, and the most authentic representation of OCD I've ever read. This is my favorite book that has a character with OCD. I adored this book. This tackles the trope that I despise the most in books about characters with OCD, which is OCD making people really good detectives. This is about our main character Aza, and her friend Daisy are on the hunt for this fugitive billionaire that's gone missing because there's a reward on his name, and Aza's OCD keeps her from being a good detective in this situation. Aza's OCD is paralyzing and debilitating, and it shows how truly not great having OCD is. This is the one that I felt the most seen by. Aza experiences intrusive thoughts and thought spirals, so she has more of the obsessive thoughts and some compulsive actions as well. When I was a kid, a lot of my OCD stemmed from medical hypochondria and being afraid of getting sick. I still tend to have that. Aza experiences that. This hit me so hard, and it was so beautifully done. I can't even put into words like how important I think that this book was for me. This came out last year, and my OCD was probably the worst it had ever been last year. Real talk. I used to be on an anti-anxiety medication. For those that don't know, obsessive compulsive disorder is also an anxiety disorder. So most people that have obsessive compulsive disorder also tend to have generalized anxiety disorder. Hey, what's up? I was on an anti-anxiety medication for quite some time, and it was very like low dosage because I refused to be on anything like really intense, just for my own personal want. I have nothing against medication. I think that if medication helps you, that's a beautiful thing. I just didn't like being on medication. So I went off my medication around the middle to end of last year. Not in the sense that I like went to my doctor and told her I didn't want to be on my medication anymore. I weaned myself off and then just stopped taking it altogether. Horrible. Don't do that. If you want to go off of your medication for whatever, talk to your doctor, talk to your psychiatrist, talk to a professional that'll help you like get through it. Don't just stop taking it like I did. There were so many physiological and psychological changes that I had to deal with on my own because I was too nervous to go to my doctor and tell her that I went off of my medication. And I felt so anxious all the time, and my OCD was so like I had so many compulsions last year because of not being on, like, as a result of not being on my medication and being peak anxiety level, and then I just kept obsessing over everything, and the obsessions really like triggered me to do old compulsions that I had never done for a while. And I'm not saying all this just to like, I don't know, get sympathy on the internet. I think that talking about mental health, we so seldom talk about the fact that like mental illness is an illness and you're not always gonna have like super great days. It's not ever the easiest thing. There are days where it's really easy and it gets easier. Like the more that I live with this mental illness, the more I learn how to get myself through the times when I'm really, really anxious. But there are days when I just am so anxious and I obsess over the smallest things. This book came out at a time where I felt so isolated. I was just in my head all the time, and I wasn't in a place where I was comfortable talking to anybody. I kind of like regressed and went back to this state of like shame and embarrassment and not wanting to talk about my mental health and not thinking it was important to tell people that my mental health was getting bad. Don't do that either. Don't follow anything that past Morgan has done to help with her mental health because it didn't help at all. Like I said, it's very intense and it's very raw, and it can be like triggering if you are easily triggered by like talk of obsessive thoughts. I personally don't get like triggered reading about other people's OCD because I'm able to differentiate the fact that this person does not have the same brain as me, and their OCD is in ways different from my OCD, even though we're similar. I really related to Aza. I think that she is a phenomenal character, and I think that this story is so important, especially when we deal with that trope of like people with OCD being detectives. But I do recommend this if you want a like raw and like super authentic look at what it feels like to be in your head like that all the time. I think that Turtles All the Way Down is phenomenal. I think it's a very important book for mental health awareness. So I think that's it. I don't feel like doing the whole like and subscribe thing in this video because this is very personal, very uncomfortable, but I think that it's conversations like these that need to happen. It feels very disingenuous to pour my heart out and tell you guys this very personal side of myself, and then at the end be like, like and subscribe, I upload when I can. It just doesn't feel right. I would love to have a dialogue with you guys in the comments. That would be really cool. I'm very nervous to be uploading this. I'm terrified, if I'm being quite honest. I think that conversations like these are so necessary in a world that is surrounded by negative stigma and stereotypes towards mental illness. I hope you guys have a phenomenal rest of your day. Thank you so much if you took the time to watch this. I'm sorry if it was a little all over the place and a little jumbled. I tend to run off and go in a bunch of different directions because that's how my brain works. My brain is a very jumbled, very vast place. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you in my next video or whatever, and I hope, yeah, be kind to people. I don't know. I feel we're really happy reading. I don't know how to end this video. Bye.